Well, I'm back from spring break and back to book reviews. And for the members out there, I just posted a very lengthy video on books about apocalyptic, like end times theology and that sort of thing. So those of you members out there that want to check that out, definitely go over to the members section and check it out. I think it's about 50 minutes long, so I didn't know if I was pushing the boundaries there on attention spans, but one of you pointed out that we are readers on this channel, so a 50-minute video shouldn't be too difficult to stomach. But back to a more traditional book review. This is War Crimes by Ramsey, Clark, and others, and that's literally what it says right there on the spine. War Crimes, a report on United States war crimes against Iraq by Ramsey, Clark, and other authors. Tony Benn is actually listed in here. And let's see, this was originally published in '92, so right on the heels of the first Iraq War, and that's an important detail here. And I have another book, also by Ramsey Clark, about war crimes in the first Gulf War. But this one I picked up on spring break, so I jumped right in and wanted to discuss a few things in here. And I haven't looked this up on Amazon to see if this one's hard to get or not. Probably not, but I did find it interesting, this little bookstore that I went, and I'll have to do a separate video just about that. I found a neat little bookstore in the western part of Denver that had a lot of eclectic books, and picked up a few, and I'll have to do a separate video just about that. But anyway, this is War Crimes, and this interests me because I was a senior in high school when the first Gulf War happened. And back then I was a stupid high school student and had very little interest in world events. I remember my mom kind of freaking out because me and one of my brothers and I guess possibly my oldest brother, we were potentially like draft age. So my mom was always, having lived through the Vietnam War, she was always hyper sensitive about the potential for drafting young men into wars. And me being a young, stupid high school kid was like, war? That sounds great. Anyway, this has some really interesting stuff in it. Jumping right in, one of the things I found of interest is it starts off explaining how the United States provoked, and there's no other way to interpret it, as they point out here, that they provoked Iraq to attack Kuwait, so there would be a pretext for the United States to go in. And there's a lot of parallels when you read that part of it, a lot of parallels between that and a lot of other modern conflicts. And any of you who have ever dated someone or known someone who was a high-functioning psychopath or narcissist will recognize that kind of behavior, where they never want to be seen as the aggressor, but they will stack the deck so that other people will, when they respond to their behavior, they will appear to be the aggressor. And there's a lot of U.S. State Department tactics that are very much in that kind of behavior spectrum. And that got me thinking. I was talking about this with a local friend of mine here about this the other day, that that's one of the disturbing things about when you read stuff like this Rand report here on extending Russia competing from an advantageous ground. That's all about how to get Russia into a proxy war. That you start to see this is what happens when you have people who have gone to school to be managers and didn't rise up through a company or any other kind of hierarchy organically. They were trained as managers and then inserted into those spots, and their degreed their credentials make them think that they have actually accomplished something when in fact they have not. And then those people, both in the corporate world and especially in the military industrial world, do a massive amount of damage. And I'm afraid a lot of the state of our country is as a direct result of that kind of mentality of creating managers in schools and then turning them loose with zero practical experience in the vocation that they're entering, and then giving them the power of life and death in the case of like the Rand Corporation. When you read stuff like this, you see how these guys have no understanding of the how this stuff will have the human toll that their decisions will have. These are all people, they're very much insulated from the consequences of their actions. So anyway, back to this. This is very much a lot of these modern conflicts. You see that again and again. And when I say modern conflicts, I mean really everything that's happened in my lifetime, all the way back to Vietnam, and possibly before, where you have these guys orchestrating these things so that country X that decides they've had enough and they finally respond, they become the villain because they finally had enough, which again, kind of the psychopathic setup there of, setting someone up so when they lose their temper, they look like the bad guy. But back to this. This has some really good stuff about the setup of the Iraq War, and they make no bones about it. Many of you that have looked into that, you've probably heard about the ambassador April Gillespie, and she's mentioned in here where Saddam Hussein actually requested an audience with her about what his issues with Kuwait. And she told him straight up, no, that's your regional concerns are not important to us, and basically gave him a green light to invade Kuwait. So there's a very interesting section just on that alone, which that right there is worth the price of the book, because again, there's so many things that are happening in the world now that are similar tactics to this. And now looking back, those of you who have been following a lot of this stuff in Syria and the second Iraq War and all that kind of stuff, know that a lot of the underpinning really goes back to the protection of the nation state of political Israel, that Israel has never been cool with the idea of any Arab nation having a standing army that could pose any kind of threat to Israel. So they're all about using the United States as kind of a blunt tool to bludgeon all these standing armies around the Middle East. And the other thing is, there's been so much propaganda in the last really 30 years about Arab Islamic terrorism and that sort of thing. And the crazy thing is countries like Iraq and Libya and Syria and Lebanon and not Iran, but mainly those Lebanon and Iraq and Syria, those were all secular governments, especially Libya, that these were countries that were anything but Islamic republics. So it's kind of funny when you cut through a lot of the propaganda, you start realizing that the biggest threats to are secular nations, and for a totally different set of reasons. Now, I dog-eared quite a few things in here, and I don't know if I'm going to get into all of this or not, but this is a good example right here. The Provoking Iraq, this chapter by Gautam Biswas and Tony Murphy. I hope I'm saying their names right. But talking about weakening Iraq and talking about how Iraq was supported up to this point where it served the interests of the U.S. State Department, and then when it ceased to serve those interests, then it became a villain. And, one of the things that I hear a lot now, and really about all of the boogeymen in all these different wars is, well, Putin's a thug, or, well, Saddam Hussein, he was a madman, or, Bashar al-Assad, he was a monster, And the problem is there's so many lies told as evidenced in books like this, so many lies that set up the general public for these wars, that when people tell me that, that's kind of lost all effect. I used to say, when people would say, oh, Saddam Hussein was a terrible guy, I'd say, yeah, but, and now I realize, wait, that's the problem with when we bear false witness. When we bear false witness against, or our country, people within our country bear false witness against another head of state, it becomes very difficult to sort out what the truth and the lies really are. Because in the instance of Saddam Hussein, I've heard all kinds of stories about, he put political dissidents into industrial shredders and feet first and things like that. And now when looking back on those, on the pre-war propaganda, and especially a lot of the stuff that we can verify is just completely and totally false, then it makes you wonder, okay, how much of that was false? And that therein is the problem with bearing false witnesses. Once you tell a lie to turn people against someone, then it can easily backfire, and all of your lies, or even the things that may or may not be true, who knows? So I've taken that approach now when people tell me, oh, Putin's a thug, or Assad is a thug, or whatever. It's like, really? How do we know? The same people that are telling me all these other things that are demonstrably false are also telling me those things. So that's the problem. So we really don't know where those guys really stand on the scale of their personal morality. But one thing about this did mention the highway of death. And for those of you my age, you might remember the highway of death was when the Iraqi army and I didn't realize this until I read this section in here, that this was actually brokered by Russia. They had a ceasefire that was brokered by Russia at the time, and this was like early 91. And as the Iraqi army was retreating back into Iraq, they were just massacred. And again, you can say, oh, well, they deserved it or whatever. And the problem is, again, we don't know if they really deserved it or not, because again, there's so much of a cloud of disinformation around what really was or was not true. But I had friends of mine in the service who had returned from Iraq. I got in right after the Iraq War, because that was one of my gung-ho things, like, man, I want a piece of the action. And then everyone I met consistently, everyone who had either been in combat or been deployed to the Iraq War, the first one, and was telling me about it, was always like, dude, you want nothing to do with that. And I never met anybody who was like, yeah, man, we stuck into those Arabs. It was very sober. In fact, a lot of people, one guy in particular, when I was on my high horse about, being all gung-ho, young, stupid soldier, and this guy told me in no uncertain terms, he's like, man, I thought like that too. He said, until I saw the first, I think it was on it was either the highway of death or somewhere around, or right around there. He was a mechanic like me, and they had to go and dismount and check trucks and vehicles that had been strafed by aircraft and make sure everybody was dead and there was nobody hiding out in there. And he said he saw in this truck that was a fellow mechanics for that side, for the Iraqis. It was a small truck that was carrying mechanical parts and stuff for their spare parts for vehicles. And it was very obviously a mechanics vehicle full of mechanics like him. And he said these guys looked like Barbie dolls just melted together. And he said it was the most horrifying thing. And he said at that moment he realized, like, this is, how real it all was, and wanted absolutely no part in it. Now, I will say, and that's a good segue into, there's one section in here on conscientious objectors in the first Gulf War, and talking about how the military made it very difficult for people seeking conscientious objector status. And one thing I take issue with, and that's true, there is conscientious objector status you can get through the military, but typically that's when you enlist. When you enlist, especially if you're drafted in wartime, and you say, hey, I have a strong religious conviction against killing, but hey, I'll serve as a medic or I'll work in some kind of support role, but I cannot kill other human beings in armed conflict. So typically that happens at the enlistment phase, and when you're enlisted, you declare that, and then your recruiter makes of that whatever they will. So when a conflict happens and you disagree with that conflict, then trying to appeal for conscientious objector status at that point is, I don't think that holds as much water as these guys say. Now, I will say from a military perspective, to me, the better case to be made is I refuse to follow an unlawful order. And I knew guys in the second Iraq war that did refuse to follow orders and refused their own deployment because they said, this is an illegal war, we are the aggressors, this is illegal under international and U.S. law, and I refuse to go along with it. That to me makes more sense. Because you do have protections, or you're supposed to, in the chain of command of being able to resist unlawful orders, because that's what keeps us, that's what differentiates us allegedly from Mustache Man followers and SS stormtroopers and that sort of thing, is that ability allegedly to be able to say, no, I refuse to follow this order because it's wrong, it's morally wrong, and it's illegal under our own legal code, and I refuse to go along with it. So anyway, fascinating time capsule on this. Again, this is like 32 years old now. And it's fascinating to go back. A lot of pictures, some stuff really heartbreaking to see. The other thing that shocked me about this, there's a whole section on Palestinians, and this is talking about the Palestinian community within Kuwait and how they wound up being, even though they had helped cooperate with the U.S. invasion of Iraq, they actually wound up under a microscope, and were actually, a lot of them were arrested and sent over to be interrogated by Israelis. And there's some kind of strange stuff about that, which I had never heard about that before. And then there's one last thing. This is what made me think about the whole secular government. There's a picture of this woman here with her burned child, which is very sad. And it talks about in that section about how prior to the first Gulf War, Iraq actually had one of the best healthcare systems in the Middle East. And again, if you look up what the state of things in Libya, you'll find a lot of the same thing, that it was a very secular country. Yes, they had different religious sects that didn't always get along, but it's just like here in the United States. It'd be like if something happened here and suddenly the Catholics and the Episcopals or the Protestants broke out in war against each other. But just because we have these different sects doesn't make us a theocracy. But that was really sad, and that was sad to see that, I think in this caption, or about the healthcare system. The war, it said, oh, here it is. In the caption, it says, before the embargo and war, Iraq had one of the best healthcare systems in the entire Middle East. The war has virtually destroyed that system. Many Iraqis believe that the U.S. intended to destroy their civilization. The Harvard team report estimated that about 170,000 children would die within a year of the end of the war from the destruction of the civilian infrastructure. And what's sad is at least that many died, and many more. I think it was Madeleine Albright who was asked if the 500,000 Iraqi children who had died, if that was worth it. And she answers in the affirmative. And that was later on from all the sanctions and everything else. But if you, like me, if you're a student of things related to warfare, and again, even though this book is 33 years old. I think I might have said 23 earlier, 33 years old. A lot of what is being talked about in here, especially about the lead up to the war and all of the intrigue that was happening behind the scenes, a lot of that is still much stock and trade of the State Department. These people have no creativity. So they just keep using the same thing again and again until they get busted at it. So books like this are definitely worth it if for that alone, to be able to see that playbook, and that keeps us from getting duped. And I know there's a lot of people, when I talk to my normie friends about some of this stuff, and they'll say, well, what are you going to do about it? Okay, so once you explain this to someone and they realize that this is a real thing, well, what are you going to do about it? Well, if enough people know and enough people say no and refuse to participate in these things, they can't happen. It's like the Iraq War, the second Iraq War, that one I was really paying attention in, is a great example of that. If the evangelical churches had refused to go along with it and said, no, this is illegal, this is immoral, this goes against our religious values, we refuse to participate, and we refuse to send our sons and daughters to go participate in this, you couldn't have a war. People have to say yes for this stuff to happen. And that is the most powerful thing in our arsenal, is the ability to say no and refuse to take part in these things. And that may have severe consequences for us, but that is our real potential as humans, is our ability to decline complicity and decline our involvement in stuff like this. So anyway, enough of that. This is, again, War Crimes, a report on United States war crimes against Iraq by Ramsey Clark and others. And Ramsey Clark is a fascinating guy. If you get a chance, look him up. He has since passed away, but that dude was a real hero, and was, I think, a really good man. And I think he had seen enough stuff in service of the U.S. government that he spent the remaining years of his life speaking out against it and drawing attention to a lot of this stuff. And I think at one point during Saddam Hussein's trial, he was even represented by Ramsey Clark. So I will stop there, but there you go, and hope you all found that edifying. And now I'm off to look this up on Amazon to see what this goes for now, because I paid, at this little bookstore I was at, I paid the paltry sum of $6 US for this. So there you go.